Blizzard is looking to improve their pre-made group finder for Mythic Plus. They just recently sent out a survey to a bunch of players with some of the changes that they're thinking of making. If you're not familiar with these surveys, basically how it works is once you get it, you look at the options and you have a scale of 1 through 5. 1 being that it's like, not really feeling it at all, I'm not interested, and 5 being like, this is a great idea, I'm highly interested. It's then collected by Blizzard, and this is what hopefully shapes the game into the direction that we, the players, want. This survey was leaked, and in this video, we are going to cover that survey. We're going to go through everything on the list, and we're going to talk about the pros, the cons, and of course, I'll throw in my personal opinion with that. So let's jump into it. Let's start off by just reading what the mission statement is for the survey. The World of Warcraft team is exploring potential changes to the pre-made group finder feature to improve the experience of creating dungeon groups. Based on your experiences with the pre-made group finder dungeon groups, how interested would you be in each of the following changes to the pre-made group finder? All right, let's talk about the very first one. Group finder can automatically form a group for you based on criteria you set as a group leader. Now, I feel like this has been kind of misunderstood by some of the general players, and thinking that this is going to be kind of like a Mythic Plus Solo Queue, kind of like how the dungeon finder works, where you just pick, like, the dungeon you want to do, you hit join queue, and that's it. It is not going to work that same way, and I'll explain how it's going to work in just a minute. But first, let's talk about like the criteria that you set, because if you go to create a group right now, you have some criteria that you can already set for people joining your group. And that would be a minimum Mythic Plus rating and a minimum eye level. So by toggling those, you can already restrict and keep people who are not inside that certain zone that you're looking for out of applying for your groups. So when it comes to the criteria, I imagine they're going to kind of expand on this, but I don't know what else they could really add in. The only thing that really comes to my mind in terms of additional criteria, and I feel like you would have to have additional criteria because it just seems really limited right now, would be something along the lines of like, have they completed the dungeon before? Like, have they timed the dungeon that you're creating previously? And I think that would be another possible toggle. If you guys think they could add some other type of criteria, then please list it down below. I played around as well with like thinking maybe you could set criteria as like having voice chat as like mandatory. But I don't know how that would exactly how that would fit in. You can set that as a goal currently on the dungeon pre-made tool. So I'm curious to know what your guys' thoughts on that. But let's talk about the automatic part, okay? Because that needs to be clarified. You don't set the dungeon, you don't hit join queue, and you just wait. Automatically, everything's going to be done the same. You go to the pre-made group finder, you hit start a dungeon, start a group, you pick the dungeon you want to do, the key level, you set the criteria, and then you list it. Now, what that's going to do is when somebody sees that, they have to hit join in order to be added to the group. So it's not like as soon as you do that, it just starts scanning the entire pool of players that are in the dungeon finder, and then it sucks them into your group. That person is still going to have to manually find your group and then apply to the group. And once they apply, if their criteria meets what you are requesting, then they're just automatically thrown into your party. You don't have to go and hit invite. So it's a good way to just kind of speed up the process. You can, I think it's a great idea in that kind of sense. You can go ahead and type in the name, you can type in your criteria that you want, and then you just hit, list it. And as soon as those people you don't have to look at your dungeon tool anymore. They just get thrown into your party, and then you guys are off. Now, there are a couple cons here, but again, it's because we don't really know what criteria is going to be. And that's why I wanted to talk about that first. So the first major con of this is, like, let's say, for instance, if the criteria remains pretty limited as far as like what we have right now, what happens if you have all melee characters apply to your group that fit what your criteria is set? So all of a sudden, you have you've got all DKs and warriors and a holy pally, right? So literally everybody is melee, or maybe it's like all ranged. Does it include like a lust or something along the lines of that? Like if you need one or you're looking for one. So that's going to be like the biggest con. Of course, that's all speculation though, because we don't, again, know what the actual like criteria is going to be set. So, then it makes me wonder, like, do they set the criteria differently? So it's like, how many melee players do you want? How many ranged characters? But then I feel like it just gets way too it just seems like it's over bloating a system. So I don't know. All right, so let's move on to the next one here. Group leader's key is resilient, which means that it's protected from depletion for the first group they lead each week. Now, straight off the top, this just sounds horrible. Like, there, at no point does this sound at all appealing. I mean, I guess for somebody who's like maybe who runs one Mythic Plus dungeon a week, like I could maybe see more appeal to this if it's like your key is resilient for the first time that you lead that key. So like if you get a key, you create a group, that key is now resilient. So if you fail, then it doesn't drop back, right? If you succeed, you get another key, and then I think that next key should also be resilient. I feel like it's a really dumb idea just to have one key that's resilient in general. It just doesn't sound good. I mean, maybe some of you guys might disagree with that. I don't think anybody can really disagree with that. My honest opinion is not only is that just a bad idea, but I personally don't think the keys should deplete at all. Like in general, I feel like you should be able to deplete a key manually if you want to. So like if you're just playing Mythic Plus, you do it, you get an upgrade, you go to the next one, all of a sudden you get there and it's like, whoa, this was way too much. You know, I've tried it a couple times. I couldn't get it. I'm going to drop it back down and then, you know, I'll work my way back there. That's how I think the keys should be done in general. I think it's a bad idea just to have them depleted anyway. That's what keeps people from using their keys. But that's one of the reasons. But just in general, I don't think keys should ever drop. I think that's a dumb idea. Anyway, let's move on to the next two. And I'm going to group these together because they're both kind of the same thing. Group leaders receive additional crests after completion of the dungeon, and then there's group leaders receive additional Valor stones after completion of the dungeon. I think they should just be combined. I honestly don't see anything wrong with that either. It gives you a little extra incentive to be the leader of the group, so it might provoke more people to be a dungeon leader. They might create the groups if they are going to get like more crests and more Valor stones. I think that should be grouped together. And I think that's a good idea just in general, just because it is and can be more of a pain to organize a group together. You know, I organized a lot of groups by myself, so I don't really see any big deal. Obviously, it would benefit me if that was the case. But I mean, then again, when it comes to Mythic Plus, I don't like, you know, it depends on the key I get. If I get a really crappy key that I don't want to run, like at all, like Dawnbreaker, I'm not a fan of the Mythic Plus Dawnbreaker. I don't want to run it. So if I get that key, it's going to sit there. I'm not going to run it. I'm not going to waste my time on doing a dungeon I'm going to try to join up another group that's running a dungeon that I want to actually run. So even with that little extra incentive, you know, it might push some people, but you know, it's a good idea just in kind of general. All right, let's go to the next one. Group Finder will recommend players with a similar skill level to you as a group leader. Now, this, of course, is a lot of speculation because we don't know how Blizzard's matchmaking system works and what criteria they are basing you and the other person on in order to gauge the similar skill level. You know, so we'll just use like a face value just as a general topic for this conversation. And that is, of course, your Mythic Plus rating. So does that mean that once you create the group, if you have an IO score of 1,000 and somebody joins or tries to join up that's like, you know, right there with you, they're like 1.1, 900, 1,000, they're right there. I'm assuming that the recommended players are going to be pushed to the top of the queue, and they're probably like highlighted inside the pre-made tool. So like, you know, when they apply, their name is highlighted just to help draw like extra emphasis, and it'll probably say like recommended beside it, helping you just kind of pull somebody in. I mean, personally, it seems kind of redundant for that to even be a thing, just in my opinion, because typically if you're running Mythic Plus, you're going to have like some type of extra add-on. I think like, I mean, Raider IO is like one of the most downloaded add-ons, you know, in CurseForge. So you're already seeing like previous Mythic Plus scores and stuff like that. So, you know, maybe, I mean, obviously them building it into their default UI is also great if it's not already there. So mixed feelings. I don't think it's really that big of a deal. I think the criteria being set is pretty much the same thing as what you're doing there. All right. And then the final one is the Group Finder will recommend players with similar playstyles or goals to you as a group leader. So there are goal choices that you can set when you create a group. You have like standard, you have completion, and you have beat timer. So I'm assuming that it's going to operate basically the same along the lines of that. You're going to go into your group finder, you're going to put whatever your playstyle and goal is, and then when you're applying to groups, the leader is going to see you apply. And if it's like, I'm really only looking to complete the dungeon, I'm not super worried about the timer, you know, then it gets recommended, you know, you get pushed to the top of that person's queue because it's a similar playstyle. Again, I feel like that is kind of like rolling into, like these last two options kind of roll into each other, just like the previous of the crests and the Valor stones. I mean, overall, I don't think it really solves much of an issue with people creating groups. And I'm going to expand on that in just a minute because it's a lot bigger than just how the pre-made tool works. I don't think it's a bad idea to improve the UI in terms of, you know, making it easier to get people with similar skill level. I do think that is a good idea, but you know, maybe this is just them trying to improve their own UI. That way add-ons are not necessarily as needed. Okay, but let's talk about like the main issue here. And then I want to talk about like the solo dungeon queue, because this is all going to go into each other. And I want to talk about the solo Mythic Plus queue, because this is something that has been discussed amongst the player base of people basically asking and being like, can't we just have the solo queue for Mythic Plus like we have for, you know, the dungeons or we have for PvP? And that's not, the thing is the only way for that to work would be if that is the only way that you can run Mythic Plus. If you still have the ability to use the pre-made finder, it only makes the situation worse. I am somebody who has tanked, I DPS, and I heal. I have a blood DK, I have an unholy DK, I have a resto shaman. I play all three roles. I've done all three across Mythic Plus. Now the overall issue here is that there is a severe lack of tanks and healers. And it's very easy to see why. Just look at all the class and specs. DPS class and specs far outnumber the tanks and healers, so there's obviously going to be a difference when it comes to the numbers here. But why are tanks more hesitant to lead a Mythic Plus run as opposed to just queuing up as a DPS spec and enjoying it? And it's quite simple. It's because of the extra added stress that goes onto the tank when they are queuing as a tank for Mythic Plus. And let's just talk about it. When a tank queues up, you immediately assume that that tank knows the exact path to take that ensures that you're going to have all of your mobs, you're not going to overpull anything, and that you're going to time it successfully. Those are three big responsibilities for a tank. And it's just a lot of added stress. Of course, this gets easier the more that you do it, and you should always start running dungeons at the Mythic 0 level to understand where mobs are and where the pathing and stuff like that is. But it's a lot to remember on top of everything, especially when you're having to do this for 8 different dungeons. It's a lot on top of a tank. And typically, if that person is unsure of the route or they make mistakes, it does constitute for people to be a little bit more toxic to them. So that just causes the hesitancy. And I don't want to talk about like just why tanks don't want to do it. I want to talk about what they can do to make tanks more comfortable with it. And this might be kind of an unpopular opinion or a hot take. I don't really know, but you can let me know in the comments. I honestly think that they should take the dungeons for Mythic Plus and make them much more linear. I think they should decrease the amount of mobs in the dungeon and they should make it more linear. These dungeons where you have different paths you can take, it's nice when you're doing it in a casual setting, but not when you're doing it in a timed, it's a race setting. So there should be a very linear path where you go through. All the mobs are spaced out accordingly. You pick it, you go through the dungeon, and once you're done, it's 100%, it's all over. This whole of multiple paths and, you know, well, if you all of a sudden miss a mob, now you defeat the final boss. Oh my God, the chest didn't trigger. We're 2% shy. We have to run back to find another mob that we can kill. Like, it's just, honestly, it's kind of stupid. That's my personal belief. I think it's stupid. It should be a much more linear path with much more mob control in terms of when you start the dungeon and when you get the last boss, you should pretty much be at 100% unless you royally screw up. But at the same point, you shouldn't reach the final boss and be like 130% mob kill. Okay, so that's my opinion. Now there are tools like the MDT that you can use in the game, but it's not the smoothest working tool. It is great, but it's not like super interactive. You know, if you could, you have to constantly close it and open it back up by setting a macro to keep the map open. That way you can, you know, where am I going? Okay, this is where I'm going. I grab these mobs, you know, I close the map. That way it's gone, not in my view, kill the mobs, pop the map open real quick again, and move to the next. And like, it's a great tool, but it just kind of is unnecessary in my opinion. Now, when it goes to talking about the healers, let's talk about the healers, right? So what is like the main issue in terms of healers? And I think people tend to get more toxic towards healers in the higher keys you go, because it's not just a healer problem, but it is kind of like a other player problem as well, because it doesn't come down to just the healer's fault. It comes down to what that DPS player is doing, because in higher keys you have to use your defenses, and if you aren't using your defensives, it's very easy to just get completely deleted before a healer can respond. So first, the biggest complaint with the healer is, and I think they fixed this in season 3, it used to be with the affixes, healers, like the burst damage was absolutely insane, especially with the affixes popping up at a time when like an AoE blast goes off. So you have like an AoE blast, plus you have like the bursting, and it just fucking wipes your group because there's zero way to respond to that, right? You can't heal through it. So season 3 did a lot better with that. I actually find the affixes more enjoyable this season as a healer personally. But the damage bursts are still just wild. But if you're a healer and you disagree or you have another opinion on that, please let me know. I don't typically push super high keys on my healer. It's just Mythic Plus high keys are just not as enjoyable for me. So I'm trying to keep this in more of a casual, semi-hardcore perspective, as opposed to those of you who are running like 13 plus. So those are my 2 options in terms of like for tanks and healers. I do want to suggest like one more option that they didn't really mention here, and that's for group merging. I feel like group merging could be really beneficial in reducing the amount of just groups where it's one DPS just chilling, waiting to fill. Okay. And let's say, for instance, we'll just use Dawnbreaker as an example here. Let's say you have Dawnbreaker, you have a +4 key, you create a group, you're now waiting. Let's say somebody else is in Dawnbreaker with a +4 key, they're waiting, but they have a healer and they're a DPS. Why not create an option so that these 2 groups can now merge together and put themselves, you know, to combine? That way now they're only looking for like 1 DPS and a tank, you know, or just something along the lines of that. And you might ask, well, what about the key? So my idea behind that as well is because both group leaders are doing the exact same key, they're doing the exact same dungeon. If that dungeon is timed, then they both receive the upgrade for that key. I feel like that could be a great way to try to merge up all of the empty groups that are just like floating in the queue, where it's literally, you can have 8 different +4 Dawnbreaker groups, and every single one of them has 1 DPS in it. And it's like, guys, like there's, you know, you can merge that down into 2 groups and be good to go. And it would help, that would help alleviate some of the bloat that's inside the pre-made tool. All right, so now that we've talked about that, let's just go over the final thing here that I want to talk about, and that is the Mythic Plus Solo Queue. I said I was going to address that at the end of this video, and that is exactly what I'm going to do. I said previously that Mythic Plus Solo Queue would only work if they got rid of the pre-made group finder. Let me explain why. A Mythic Plus Solo Queue is only going to benefit the DPS. They are the primary audience that is going to use that, because DPS have the hardest time to get into a group. Again, I went back talking about where I play all 3 roles. If I'm a DPS player, it takes me a while to get into a group. If I'm a tank or healer, I pretty much get to pick whatever I want to do, and I don't have to worry about it. Solo queue is going to work the same way. Why am I going to queue up for a solo queue, not knowing what I'm going to get, when I can look at the groups, see exactly what I'm going to get, and I can apply to them? So let's say out of 100 players, you're going to have 90 of the DPS. 90 out of 100 of those DPS are going to use the solo queue. 10 out of 100 of those tanks are going to use the solo queue. And that's primarily just because they don't really want to F with the pre-made finder. They just be like, whatever, I don't really give a fuck. Let's go ahead and, you know, just queue up. Boom. And then I'm in. That is why it won't work. The solo queue would only work if they completely removed the pre-made finder, and implementing a solo queue would just mean that as a DPS player, you're going to be sitting in the queue for 30 plus minutes, maybe longer, probably longer because of the difference in numbers, but just wasting away. So it's just not a good idea. And again, it doesn't address the main problem, which is they have to have more tanks, they have to have more healers. So let me know what your guys' thoughts are down in the comments. Any ideas do you think are appealing? What do you agree, disagree with? Let me know. I don't care. I'm interested to hear everybody's opinion on this. And I'm always interested to see them do something to Mythic Plus to help increase the audience for it, because Mythic Plus is fun. It is enjoyable. It's just a really clunky system, at least to me. That's how I personally feel. And yeah, so like, subscribe if you enjoy the content. I do WoW stuff. Channel members, 99 cents a month. It gives you early ad-free access to all my stuff. I also have a Prefessional merch store. I'll see you in the next one.